we begin, I just want to introduce Barry. He is the Fraunces Tavern restaurant beverage manager. He began working in his local bar in Dublin when he was just 15 years old, totally legal. Fortunately for him, that local bar was also one of Ireland's most famous and revered bars dating back to 1833, and it was here he learned the importance of the bar and its role within the community. Several years later, on a weekend trip to New York, Barry visited Fraunces Tavern and immediately fell in love with the building, fascinated by its history and its role with contemporary New York. 2 years later, he became our beverage director and has worked in that position for almost 8 years, helping the tavern grow from strength to strength. We are very lucky to have Barry. He is absolutely wonderful. He makes some of the best drinks that I've ever had, and I'm happy that he could come here to join us. So I'm going to hand it over to Catherine for our demo. She's making a flip. So Catherine, Tell us a little bit about what a flip is.
So a flip was a very popular mixed drink from the 1800s, and just about every tavern had their own recipe, and it actually had, every recipe had its own name. So there's some really fun names that I'll kind of go through some of them after I make the flip. But a flip is based around beer, which was ubiquitous in colonial America. So it's beer, rum, another ubiquitous drink in colonial America. It has eggs in it and some sugar. So it's a pretty interesting drink. I thought I'd do something that's got a little bit of flair for our finale here. So I will start. So to begin, you need 2 tankards or pitchers, and in one you will put the eggs kind of mixed up, and you want to, pro tip, mix them up really well because the whites actually cook faster. So if you have like floating egg whites, you'll get little scrambled eggs when you add the hot beer. So pro tip, mix the eggs well beforehand. So I've got the eggs. I'm going to put in a tablespoon of sugar and about 1.5 ounces of rum and a little bit of nutmeg. And I have my handy nutmeg grater here. So I've got my nutmeg. And I'll stir that around a little bit. Now in the other tankard, you're going to put about 8 ounces of hot beer. You want to use probably an English ale, something that's not too bitter. So I just heated mine on a saucepan, which is the quote unquote civilized English fashion. We'll talk about how the Americans jazzed it up a little bit. So I've got my hot beer in one tankard. I have my eggs and rum and sugar in the other. And what I'm going to do is mix them up very carefully, but very quickly. So I'm going to pour the hot beer into the rum, and then I'm going to pass them back and forth really fast to mix it up and hopefully not get scrambled eggs as I do it, and hopefully not spill all over the floor. So you would pass it back and forth until it's well mixed and velvety. So I'm going to do a couple more here. And I did not spill any on the floor. Excellent. And then I'll pour it into my little mug because sometimes you do get a little bit of scrambled egg at the bottom. And I don't want to drink that. And that is your flip. So that's a traditional English flip. Flip developed in English taverns. And then it came over to America about the 1690s when rum was like starting to really get big, and the colonists really took to rum. And they jazzed it up by taking a red hot poker that they would heat up in the fireplace, which is why I'm sitting in front of the Keeler Tavern's taproom fireplace here. So we're gonna heat up our poker really, really hot, and we're gonna plunge it into the drink. to kind of reheat that beer, and it'll froth and kind of overflow, and it actually caramelizes the sugars a little bit as well. So it gives it a little bit of a caramel flavor, burnt flavor. And the flip it's pretty good. I actually don't mind it. It's kind of earthy. I don't know. So everybody, when you register, you should have received the recipe so you can try it at home. If you have tried it, let us know how you like it. It'd be really interesting. So the tool that is used to heat up the flip, that red hot poker, has a couple of different names. It's called a loggerhead or a flip dog.
Got that one. Oh, never mind.
Oh, yes.
Not with my virtual background, but I've got one from our educational kits. So they're very, very heavy.
Yeah. So Fraunces Tavern has a big one. Here at Keeler Tavern, we have a very small one. So this is for small flips. So as I said, every tavern would have their own kind of recipe for flip, and usually it came with its own name. So some of the different names for flip I've found were bellow stop, hotchpotch, and also cram bam bull. That was a good one. I like that one.
Did they all include egg? That's my question. They were all kind of the same, or like the same ingredients with different amounts of the ingredients, or?
So the basic two, the beer and the rum, were all in all of the recipes I've been able to find. Most of them had egg. I've seen a couple that substitute cream for the egg.
Okay.
And then there's like one or two that had neither. So they didn't have cream or egg. But mostly the difference is like the type of sweetener you're using. Mm-hmm. So whether you're using sugar or molasses or dried pumpkin was another one. Or depending on where you are, maybe maple syrup, all sorts of things. And as we'll find out later, like there's a lot of variety in sweeteners in beer, in the making of it and the drinking of it. So yeah, and then there's one name for the flip that I came across, was the Yard of Flannel, and it seemed to be related to Fraunces Tavern. So Mary, do you want to tell us if you found anything about that?
Anytime Samuel Fraunces' name is mentioned in anything, because we don't have a lot of information to go on, I go down a very, very weird research hole. It was allegedly served at the Evacuation Day banquet. Every time it's mentioned, there's no like, here's where I got this information from. So it seems like it's one of those like reshuffled pieces of information that everybody's like, well, if so-and-so said it, it should be true. So I think my quest for the summer is to put together some sort of like beverage book, because I would love to be able to be like, this is what he served, because we know that he served punches and he had rum and he had a little bit of everything. But if we had an actual like personalized recipe, ooh, it'd be the happiest day of my life. Stay tuned. Maybe I'll have something when we come back for season 2. And that would be my demo. So we're joined with Barry. Hi, Barry.
Hey, everyone. How are you doing?
Barry is our wonderful beverage manager downstairs at the restaurant. And I thought he'd be great because since this conversation is about beer, there's a very special beer that we have on tap downstairs. Do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah. So we actually also have it in the can, and I figured I'd just bring one to show you guys what it looks like. So it's so when we wanted to have a house beer, obviously being, an historic tavern, we wanted to kind of, have our own beer that we could, share with the customers. So we did a lot of research into the development of beer in America, what styles would have been popular at the time of the American Revolution, and how could we kind of bring that, into this century. A lot of the times when we find these old recipes, they're not exactly, how we would like things to taste right now. Is the easiest way for me to say that. So a lot of the times they might be overly sweet, or and you'll see that, like, even with Catherine's flip, that I could see some of your faces there when you were hearing the ingredients, and not everyone wants to have egg in their cocktail, especially possibly cooked egg, or scrambled egg. It's a weird one. So we did a lot of research, and we decided to team up with a local brewery out of Staten Island called Flagship, and we had a lot of meetings with their master brewer, and we wanted to go for something that was, that kind of recognized the history of ales in America. So we went for something a little darker in color. I'm just gonna crack this guy open and show you what it looks like. I'm sorry we don't have one for everyone in the audience. So yeah, you'll see it has this beautiful copper color, which would have been historically accurate. Caramel malts would have been used at the time. Malted barley, obviously the key ingredient for beer. Then water. Then obviously the hops for bitterness, and also to prolong its life. So the thing about beer is that can only be really brewed at certain times of year, especially back then because of the lack of refrigeration. So they needed to add the hops to prolong the life of the beer, to get it through, a hot summer or too cold a winter. And then there was the mystery ingredient, which was yeast. Yeast is a really funny ingredient because they didn't know it existed back then. They didn't know that they were using yeast in beer production until the 1800s nearly. And it was the scientists that started to recognize that certain beers tasted different depending on, what cask they were brewed in. And there's funny stories about this because some brewers felt that a certain barrel made a better beer, and they were right because it was infected with a yeast, and it was this like really crazy thing that people were brewing beer and they didn't really know exactly what they were doing in every way that they know now. In fact, Guinness, obviously one of the more famous, still to this day add old beer when making new beer, and that goes back to that era as well, where they had a really good batch of beer and they didn't know about the yeast, so they would add that old batch into a new batch to try recreate that great beer flavor. Anyway, so we went up to Flagship and we came up with this, which we actually call an American amber. Amber ale is a popular, brew type, and an American ale was a popular brew name. We decided to put the two of them together and call them an American amber, and it's very popular. It's our best-selling beer today, actually, and it's very approachable. It's got some sweetness to it, some floral notes, and people are very happy with it.
It is definitely one of my favorite beers to have after work, not during work. I feel like I should say that. After work, it's just a nice summer. I don't know. I think it's a nice summer beer. It's a very casual one. It goes with a lot of food, which I don't know what that means, but it tastes good with everything that I've ever eaten downstairs at the restaurant also.
Yeah, that's a big one. So you want to be pairing your beers or your drinks with particular foods, and I think this beer pairs well because it's just straight down the middle. It's not too sweet, not too spicy, it's just, and it pairs well with everything.
Yeah, it's definitely.
And you're the only place in the city where that sells it, correct?
Yeah, it's brewed especially for us, and it's been a great relationship. And I was telling Mary earlier that there has been a couple of times where they had to bring the keg over on the Staten Island ferry, because we were running a little tight, and we had a good week and they didn't anticipate that. So they were like, oh God, we better get you this beer quick. So they brought it over on the ferry, which was pretty cool.
the most New York City thing I've ever heard. Dirk asks, is that the San Francisco ale is closer to a lager or to an IPA?
Hey Derek, how are you? Nice to see you here. So it's an ale. So the person asking the question I know well. He's from Germany and he's a big fan of his lagers. And the lager beer kind of came after the ale. And lager means to store. And again, that temperature was very important in brewing beer. And actually, the Germans used to store that beer in under mountains, in caves, to try get that kind of temperature. But this beer is an ale, which means it's top fermented, and it helps give it that fruitiness that I think Mary, you were saying that you kind of liked, and that comes from the ale. But it'd be closer to like an IPA, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I will say I am a very big fan of fruity beers. I really like the Harpoon raspberry one. So anytime there's like a fruit undertone, I am all about it. So that's a good indication, I think, if anybody wants to try it or come to the bar and try it.
Yeah, definitely.
So I want to talk a little bit more about how you came into the space and worked with a 300-year-old building and one of the oldest taverns, and how you wanted to pay homage to that. Like you made a point to make this ale, make the San Francisco ale, and even the other cocktails that you have on the menu kind of pay homage to the 18th century. And what's your experience kind of creating those drinks and moving around in that kind of way?
Yeah, we did want to pay homage to the history of the building, but in a more kind of direct and meaningful way. I think a lot of the times, like bars and restaurants that are tied with history just try to recreate exactly what was done back then, whereas we try to focus more on the philosophy. So like a lot of the founding fathers would have, been farmers, would have had their own orchards, would have grown their own fruits, and would have made their own concoctions, ciders and meads and different drinks like that. So that's what we kind of wanted to do. And so we bring, a lot of, natural kind of resources like fruits and seasonal things like that into our mixes. And even when we recreated, we do a punch, which is a kind of a variation on some of the more famous punches created back in those times. And we wanted to bring those real fruits in to the punch and develop that flavor profile that would kind of echo what was done back then. I think it creates a more holistic kind of menu. It's not all bought in. It's created by us, on site, and it does kind of echo to what would have happened and what would have been done back then. And it's funny, when you look back at these recipes, and you're going to hear soon about some of the bizarre ingredients, but necessity is the mother of invention. And, a lot of the times it was what was in front of them. And we try to do the same thing, like using seasonal products. And, so we're, peaches will be coming into season soon. So I'm working on a peach infused bourbon for a cocktail, which, we've done before, and it's like amazing.
That sounds delicious. I'm very excited for the summertime now. The perks of working above a bar, ladies and gentlemen.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I can probably imagine, Catherine, when we were doing the research for this and figuring out all of the 18th century notes and all of the ingredients that they were using. I loved the spruce one because I can just imagine that it tasted like Christmas. Yeah. Just my notes fell. Just the amount of different ingredients that were used. It didn't seem that much different than the things that we kind of do today. Of like, I've seen some weird, crazy flavors. So we think that spruce is crazy. Molasses was a really big one. I found William Penn talking about the importance of molasses as like an important note in the beer. So yeah, I'm waiting for December because I want to go out and find spruce beer. I don't think you guys carry it downstairs, right?
It's so hard to get, and I'm so sad about that. So I was introduced to spruce beer a few years ago. They're made so rarely, and they're They're only made in specific parts of the country. I had a Canadian spruce beer many years ago, and it was amazing. And it's funny because spruce is something that some IPAs try to reproduce with that kind of pine quality. But if you ever get your hands on a spruce beer, I highly recommend it. It's really tasty.
It's got very high levels of vitamin C, so it keeps the scurvy away. So it's like a twofold kind of situation.
Yeah.
Very important. Very important.
Very important for 2020. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was really interested in the spruce beer as well. Just reading about it, and it seemed to be, especially here in New England, kind of more popular and more, people drank it more than just a regular straight barley beer, like a normal ale or what we think of as beer today. But the thing I found really interesting was that it was particularly popular in the springtime, which is like,
They got it wrong.
how, if you could find it, it's usually Christmas time, right? But in the 18th century, spruce beer was for the springtime. And I've heard it described as the wholesomest drink, which I thought was very nice. And also some of the rations for Revolutionary War soldiers was actually spruce beer.
Oh, no.
I read that it was either they got 1 quart of spruce beer or cider per day. So that was something really interesting, I thought.
There's actually there's a beer that is brewed by monks in Belgium and in Germany, the different varieties of it, and it's called liquid bread. They call because they actually drink it while they're fasting, because it's got all the nutrients that they would need, that they would not be getting from food. So like beer is actually very nutritious, and it just obviously depends on the amounts you drink, which is an important note.
Yep. Nutritious, folks. You heard it here first. There's no going back on that one.
Well, that kind of takes it all the way back to when humans like discovered beer and how to make beer, right? Because that's beer is kind of one of the oldest drinks that we make, and it really is. It's grains, it's cereal grain, and water and sugars, and then yeast that kind of comes out of the air. And so if you've got some sort of like grain gruel sitting there and you've left it and it kind of ferments, then all of a sudden you've either got beer. If it was like watery gruel, it turns to beer. If it's like thick, maybe it bakes in the sun and you've got bread. So they kind of, bread and beer really do develop hand in hand in that way. So
It was interesting, especially because we had done cider already, looking at the alleged statistics, because I mean, all of these are, take it with a grain of salt. How much beer everybody was intaking and how much it really was part of like everyday life. I found it was, I highlighted it because it was such a high amount that I just almost didn't believe it. It was by the time of the Revolutionary War, colonists older than 15 drank 3.7 gallons of spirits per year, which is the equivalent of 7 shots per day. And then by 1790, that figure swelled to 5 gallons in addition to 34 gallons of beer and 1 gallon of wine. So remember, this is a time when water was not clean. They also didn't think that it was, even when it was clean and it was boiled and sanitized, that you should be drinking it. It was actually considered bad for your health. So when you had to hydrate, you went to things like cider and you went to things like beer and apparently wine in your spirits. And it's always one of the funniest questions when the kids come in and we talk about, what did you drink? What did you like? What did you eat? And I was like, kids, they would have beer and they would just go, oh, really? And I'm like, it's not the beer that you think it is, but it's a healthy, like, you can't drink from your hydro flasks right now, guys. Like, it wasn't the same. But it really,
we actually we have a couple of questions here which tie into what you guys are talking about right now, which is fascinating. So one is, was the alcohol content lower, right? And then another one is about mass production versus local production. in the 18th century? Were there like, larger distributors, etc.? So maybe you guys can speak to that.
I definitely think that the alcohol level was lower. I don't think it was as high as it was. I'm sure the spirits were just as high, because I know when we were talking about the apple brandy and how high it was, that was like 100 billion proof. So I would imagine that, some of it was still very high. Local produced, I did find that, because like Barry was saying, they had a very short shelf life. So you would have to brew it in very small batches. So this was a very women domestic made brew. I guess that's the right word for it. So they would batch it in small batches. So when Samuel Fraunces would have an order, it would be a very homebrew kind of situation. So like somebody in the bathtub making liquor during Prohibition would put it in a barrel and bring it to the tavern. So not a lot of imported beer, but definitely imported liquor. So I'm imagining for like a rural tavern at Keeler Tavern, it was probably like literally downstairs, rolled in 10 feet and served to people.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely in the Americas, I found it was definitely kind of a home brew situation, especially in the rural areas. I think, as cities develop and you start to get more specialization, you are going to have actual brewers who are making, even if they're making small batches. But definitely out here in Ridgefield, if we're making beer, it's going to be Mrs. Keeler in her kitchen making a batch of beer. And so, as Mary said, it's very women-centric beer, which does come from Europe. Like in medieval Europe, women were the brewers. Actually, the term brewster, it refers to a female person who is brewing beer. So there were a lot of brewsters in medieval England, but actually by the time Europeans are settling America, back in England, the men have kind of taken over brewing because it has become more commercialized. And they pushed the women out and came up with all these reasons why women were not allowed to brew beer, right? They said that they were like biologically incapable of brewing beer, or it was like witchcraft, and they were corrupt, and they were charming men to induce them to drink. But you come over to the colonies and you don't have a brewer who has a whole setup. You don't have like a professional maltster who can make everything. So if you want beer, you have to make it yourself, and it's going to happen in the kitchen. So it's going to be the women who are doing it. So I have been looking in the records in Ridgefield, and for some reason, we don't see anything related to brewing that I could find. I'm sure if we went into like estate documents and things like that, maybe things would come up. But based on the ledgers that I've been looking at, I found one reference to beer in all of our ledgers and no references to barley and things like that. So I am going to share my screen here so we can see. I did take a picture of the ledger. So this ledger is from 1825. So it's a little bit after the Revolution. And this is when Timothy Keeler's son, William, was running the establishment as a hotel. And you can see here is an account for two gentlemen who are staying kind of 2 days. And if you'll notice, the second to last one is they were charged 12.5 cents for liquor and beer. So that is the only reference I found to about beer in any of our ledgers, and even in any reference to barley. So my suspicion is that if people are growing barley here in Ridgefield, they're growing just enough for their needs. and they're probably making it, every person's making it themselves. And because that's the other thing is our earlier ledgers, the Timothy Keeler ledgers from the 18th century, are his store records, not necessarily his tavern records. So he's obviously not selling quantities of beer to people, probably because they're making it at home, but they still might be coming to the tavern and drinking beer, as they obviously did at least once at Williams Hotel. But I did find that interesting. I do know here in Ridgefield, there is an area right at the south border called Hop Meadow, which is known to have wild hops. And that's a name that was around since the early 1700s. So we do know there is, the ingredients are all there. So I imagine they were making beer.
I definitely was able to find a couple of recipes. I mean, Washington had a recipe for small batches of beer. So it definitely was, the fact that you even found something on your ledger is pretty amazing, because it just seems like I found a recipe to make spruce beer. So they're very small quantities to go into this in the first place. It's not like you're making one for a giant banquet. So they do exist.
Yeah.
But again, it's just like when you were trying to put together recipes and we're nobody wrote down what you were going to do with all the ingredients. And now we're in the reverse problem of well, you bought it. What did you do with it? Where is it?
Yeah.
And that's the importance of note taking, ladies and gentlemen, is so in 200 years from now, you'll help those historians.
Yeah. The other thing I did find out is that, kind of to go back to the alcohol content question, is there were different levels of beer, that, different strengths of beer. So you did have a very strong beer that was kind of available for the wealthy people, the upper class. Then you had what's called table beer, which would be the standard served in the tavern. It's about what we would get today, I think. I found a reference from Colonial Williamsburg when they tried to recreate, and they said it was about 6% alcohol, ABV. So it's about what we've got. And then there was small beer. So small beer is the second kind of batch you make from the malt and the yeast, and it's really low alcohol, and that's for kids. That's what you would serve kids, or servants, or the really poor who can't afford normal table beer. And so that was something. So if with the cider also, there was the low alcohol version as well. And so you do have a low alcohol beer available, because I think that's one of the things that people do, and it astonished me when you think about how much beer kids are supposedly drinking. But once you realize they're probably drinking small beer, it's a little bit less astonishing, I think. Yeah.
I'll tell that to my toddler. She'll love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think because I've worked at a tavern museum for so long, of how ingrained drinking is in everyday life, and how many people were drinking and what they were drinking, and even how far back it goes of, when New Amsterdam was founded, you had your city hall and you had a tavern opened up almost immediately. And there was outrageous liquor and tavern culture of, you couldn't drink on Sundays. And if you had to open your tavern on Sundays, it had to be 3 hours after the last sermon, just to make sure everybody was still sober before they went to church, kind of a thing. And it's just it's not that much different, but it is. But I can also just you always hang out with your friends. You're let's go get a beer. It's just a little probably better for you.
So when I started working in that bar back when I was 15, I was definitely working. in Ireland, we still had what was called Holy Hour on a Sunday, which meant that the bars would have to close legally for 2 hours to allow the men to get home and get their food and go to church and then come back. But like even in recent Irish history, it was still a thing, and it was, as I say, it was called Holy Hour. And it used to be every day of the week, but by the time I started working, it was just on Sundays. But it was still a thing, you know.
What was it like working at a bar so young?
I mean, I loved it. I did lie about my age. But I think the legal age was 16. I said I was like 16. Well, not exactly, you know, crazy. But I really enjoyed it. It was really an interesting look into, because my parents don't drink. So I came from a household where my mother's actually what they call a pioneer, which obviously means different things here. But in Ireland, a pioneer is someone who, you know, makes a promise to God never to drink alcohol. So that my mother grew up as a pioneer. So she's never drank a drop of alcohol in her whole life, you know. So I grew up in a very different kind of environment. So like it was an eye opener into seeing how the other half lived. And my neighbors, like, because it was a local bar, but you know, it was crazy. And you know, I always like to refer to a local bar as kind of a large dysfunctional family. Like you've got all the different characters. You've got the mothers and the fathers, and you've got the crazy uncle, and you've got all these factors, and they all put up with each other. They all argue, but they all are there for each other. And I have seen people have blazing rows, you know, but you know, shake hands and, you know, see you tomorrow. You know, so it is a fantastic, it's fantastic eye opener to see that sense of community, you know.
So Barry, as a question, so how did you like experience the whole COVID, you know, shutdown? Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. It was the word of the week, the month, the year was surreal. Obviously, as it happened, you know, and how things happen with time and faith, I don't know, because we closed down. New York City closed down its bars the night before St. Patrick's Day, and St. Patrick's Day is obviously a significant day for Irish people. But I have found, I've lived around the world, I've found that St. Patrick's Day for a lot of people is the starting of spring and summer. Like a lot of people, that's when they start thinking about plans for the summer. And so it was crazy that we were getting ready to start kind of 2020, and on St. Patrick's Day we were emptying the shelves. So it really was surreal. You know, it's funny because as you know, when you run a tavern, you're always looking at the future, and you're always looking around the corner to see what's going to happen. You know, like we had to close down for Hurricane Sandy. You know, so we've experienced these things before. So it's funny to think about that. In February, we were talking about how COVID might affect us. You know, we were already kind of saying, you know, looking at if the worst happens, what will we do? But honestly, in our wildest dreams, I don't think we expected complete shutdown to happen. You know, we thought we would have hand sanitizers on tables before we would have a shutdown, but it all happened so quickly, you know. And it was surreal. It was also quite nice to see how people behaved, you know. The owner of the bars and restaurants, Eddie, he actually ordered food as he would have normally, knowing that he might be closing down, and then gave the food away to staff on that day, like allowed people to kind of help themselves to what was in the kitchen. And to see people kind of looking out for each other was very nice and very humbling indeed to see. And that we weren't the only ones. You could see that around New York, and seeing people kind of looking out for each other and making sure everyone was okay. So it was really nice. I remember talking to my mother about it, and she was like, it was like she felt it was like how she had grown up, people just looking out for everyone, you know. And I think it was definitely something that we saw in New York. And you know, you don't think about New York that way, but it was really nice to see people just looking out for each other.
Yeah, I remember I started coming back to work in July, August, something like that, once a week. And we had gone outside, and remember sitting down with a bunch of staff members, and I was like, okay, the restaurant's all right. I got some food, I got a San Francisco ale, and I was like, we're good. This is all right. It was nice because it's an interesting dynamic working with a restaurant on the downstairs and a museum upstairs, because it's not something we do every day, which is, you know, we sacrifice outdoor space for beer downstairs, which is great. So it's good to make sure that the restaurant's doing good and the museum is doing good, because it's such a what's the word of just like we rely on each other so much, and I don't think people understand that sometimes. So it's when they're doing good, we're doing good, and when we're doing good, they're doing good. So
yeah, and I do think, you know, like especially Fraunces Tavern, like we talk about how they are part of the community, but they really are. And I think people feel better when they're open, if that makes sense. You know, like I think when we started to reopen, like people were reaching out from all around America and the world who were like, it's so good to see you open. And it helped people feel a bit normal again when it did reopen. I think that was really something that we saw as well, which is also quite lovely.
I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I am going to put you on the spot. Matthew asked, what's your favorite porterhouse beer?
Oh, I mean,
or which is your best selling book? I mean, which one is your favorite?
They are 3 different questions. And for the answer for each is it depends. So I love them all dearly, like they're my own, because sometimes they are. But the red ale is actually probably our staff favorite. And it's funny because it's for similar reasons that the Tavern Ale, the Samuel Fraunces Ale, does so well. It has this balance to it of kind of fruited flavors, like a little bit of sweetness from that. And it's funny talking about beer in general. In Ireland, beer is not strong. And on average, a beer in Ireland is 4%, 4.2%. And the original Guinness, which would have been a working class drink, was 4.2%. And the idea is that you could go back to work after having a couple for lunch, and with your ploughman sandwich. But the plain porter is also amazing. And honestly, the oyster stout is possibly the best oyster stout I've ever tasted. There's not many oyster stouts out there, so that's probably some of the reason.
That one.
Oyster stout, it's interesting. So fish products are actually used quite a lot in beer, and it's funny when we're talked about how recipes were weird back then. Recipes are only not weird now because we found alternatives. So Guinness was actually technically not suitable for vegetarians up until I think the 80s or 90s, when they found a different way to clarify, to kind of to make the beer look clear. But initially fish guts was used in the brewing process, just to, yeah.
Which is great because we're located on Pearl Street with oysters
Yes.
everywhere.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely a lot of weird flavors. I'm definitely interested in trying a spruce. A lot of fruity ones I found too. It was the spectrum of flavors, which was one of my favorite quotes that I had found when I was doing my research. So it was wheat, corn stalks, maple sap, elderberries, gooseberries, nuts, barks, other kinds of roots, pine chips, hemlock, and assorted leaves. So we'll leave that into the taste interpretations.
Yeah. I mean, I found a lot of different kind of flavors, and the colonists seem to like to experiment. It kind of Yankee ingenuity again. You don't have, because one of the things I found was that early settlers in Massachusetts found that barley didn't grow all that great, because our climate is a lot more temperamental than the climate in England. And so they had a lot of trouble growing enough barley to make enough beer for the population, even as small as it was. And so they kind of just threw a little bit of everything in there. You don't have enough beer, add some corn or rye or wheat or whatever. You couldn't get sugar, well, put in something else that's sweet. Throw in a pumpkin, some molasses, whatever you want, a persimmon, things like that. And my favorite thing I found was this little poem about what to do if you don't have enough barley. So the poem, it's very short. It says, "If barley be wanting to make into malt, we must be content and think it no fault. For we can make liquor to sweeten our lips of pumpkins and parsnips and walnut tree chips."
Oh my God, we have to start singing that every day. That's amazing. Where did you find that?
It was in like an article I was reading that it was like about, look at all these weird things they put into beer.
It's definitely one of my favorite like tavern tastings that we've done, because it was just like, I thought I knew beer, and then I did like 2 weeks worth of research and I was like, I know nothing.
Yeah. So I think by the 18th century, we're starting to get like pretty standard, at least beers start to show up in like the recipe books.
Yeah.
Like standard recipes. So you do have like the standard spruce beer, the hopped beer, things like that. And so I did pull a couple just to show everyone. We have a couple of spruce beer recipes from right at the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century, so the 1790s thereabouts. And then the other thing that was really important was, how do you save a barrel of beer that's gone sour? Because especially in a rural place where maybe you're just making beer for your family, sometimes you don't drink it fast enough and you're not going to throw it away. So you're going to save it. And what this recipe suggests is that you add some oatmeal into the beer and let it stand for a month. And then you throw in a piece of chalk as big as a turkey's egg. And then you close it up for a month. And then you can tap the barrel and start drinking your beer again. So,
all right.
In case anyone's got some beer that's gone sour.
What do you think, Barry? New limited edition Samuel Fraunces ale coming our way?
I'll try it.
Oh, that's going to be a hard sell.
Crazily enough, it's not the first time I've heard of chalk in beer. There's an ale in England that they actually thought was like they could brew elsewhere until they realized there was gypsum, which is a chalk base that was in the water. Water is by far the most important ingredient when it comes to brewing beer, because it's so hard to replicate in other places. And it's the reason why most breweries ended up in Colorado, because the water was fantastic for brewing. But yeah, there is an ale in England that they throw chalk into when they're brewing it to try and mimic that flavor profile. So there you go. Crazy.
The same can be said for water and bagel production.
Yes, indeed. Back to bread.
Well, I was reading up on when it started to, because I was interested in the 18th century was home brews and everybody making it for themselves and like small batches, of when it became more popular and you became actually able to make it shelf stable and send it out, and you get these big old companies. And it wasn't until about the 1820s, 1830s that when the German immigrants start coming in, who have actual beer production history, and they start using things like yeast, that it makes that big shift and that big jump into, we don't have to just make it for our families, we can make it everywhere. And, you know, most people go German beer, like lager and stout, and I'm showing my new one. I don't know much about beer. I'm showing my cards, but like that really starts to take a big, like, this is now a professional field. The Germans are coming over. They're actually showing us as professionals how to make it, how to keep it shelf stable, how to keep it from spoiling. So I'm like, there we are. They know what they're doing, folks.
Oh yeah.
And Barry, there's another question here from Matthew. So the second part of this question is that it's about the name of IPA. Gets its name from the journey from Great Britain to India.
Mm-hmm.
Were beers being shipped to Fraunces from abroad, or were they all locally made?
So the term IPA is India Pale Ale, and it was actually a lot of the beer styles of the time were again born out of necessity. So Catherine the Great, her favorite beer was an imperial stout. The reason why it was an imperial stout is because for it to make the journey to be shelf stable, it had to be very strong in alcohol, and that became, you know, known as a Russian imperial stout for that reason, even though it was coming from brewed in England, you know. And the IPA is exactly the same. So as we all know, the British were fond of traveling the world and claiming things as their own. And they were in India at the time and they had their people there, and they wanted to send them beer. And the problem was that when they sent the beer would last for like a week or two, and then it would go off. So they knew that hops was an ingredient to preserve. So they threw all the hops they could think of into that beer, not for flavor. They didn't think it tasted good. They just wanted it to make it there. And the idea was that by the time it got there, 12 weeks later or whatever, that then it would be palatable. But the thing is, as things happened, they started to, a few bottles made it out of the brewery. I don't think, they were supposed to possibly, and people started to drink it and acquire the flavor for it. And that's how we have IPA and the India Pale Ale, which was never brewed in India. It was always brewed in and around London and like shipped over.
Well, it gets its name, I think, from like the Dutch West India Company, I think, because I think that time makes sense. Yes.
Well, it was the East India Company,
yeah.
which was the British version. So, it's actually very interesting because these were actually these trading companies were actually their armies, and it was the change from kind of armies basically to government funded corporations. And it's a very interesting time in history when it was, and you'll see it on old English products that have Her Majesty's soap or whatever. And I think it stems from that time where a lot of these companies would have answered to the Queen essentially, and a lot of those because there was a big battle for trading routes at the time between the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the British, and so these trading companies were essentially armies that used to try get those commodities back home.
Yeah, because when the company came to New Amsterdam, one of the first things that they did was establish the first bar on Wall Street. Well, where Wall Street is now. So I'm just like, they knew what they were doing. It's New York City's founded on business.
Oh yeah.
Economic colony. It's the only one that was like, we're here to make money and nothing else. And I think solidly nothing has changed in New York City, which is good and bad.
Yeah.
That's a discussion for another.
Yeah.
I wonder, Catherine, were you able to find, did you make boiled eggs? Did you make scrambled eggs? I saw you take a sip.
No, there's no scrambled eggs in it. So
okay.
It was good.
I was going to say, it's been an hour. How are we doing with it? Well, it leads to my question of, were you able to find a way? I know we were talking. Oh, there's a toddler screaming in the background. Were you able to find a way, any research to show how to unspoil beer?
Yeah, so I did have, there's that one recipe I showed about, you know, throwing in the chalk and the oatmeal kind of to make your sour beer palatable. But I think for the most part in the 18th century, generally you were making small enough batches and drinking it fast enough that hopefully it wasn't going bad. But I mean, that was kind of one of the reasons that hops were originally added to beer, right? Was the preservative qualities. That was another reason why Americans turned to spruce, because if they didn't have enough hops, the spruce had some of the similar qualities as well as similar taste to hops. But one of the interesting things I found was back in the 17th century, was that the term ale and beer were like very specific things. So like today we often use ale and beer kind of interchangeably. But when hops were first introduced into beer making, beer was hopped. So if something said it was a beer, it had hops in it. Ale very specifically could not have hops. Ale had to be malt, water, sugar, yeast. That was it. And it was like written in legislation and things like that. But once you get into the 18th century, hops, you needed them to preserve your beer well enough. So then it kind of became, the two terms became synonymous. So yeah, there was a couple of things, you know, about making sure your beer is not gone bad. But the fact of beer going bad is one of the reasons why New England was settled in the first place. So the passengers on the Mayflower, they were delayed in leaving Europe, and they had some problems, some storms on the journey over. And so they were getting low on beer before they could make it to Virginia, which was their final destination. So the captain of the Mayflower decided to anchor in Plymouth Bay off Cape Cod, and he wanted to make sure that he had enough beer to supply his crew on the journey back to England, because that was part of their pay. And so he basically just kicked the passengers off. So the Pilgrims had to go onto land and fend for themselves. And he kind of took the rest of the beer and went home. While the Pilgrims kind of scrambled to try and figure out how can we make our own beer, and drank the thankfully clean water in Massachusetts. So yeah, so beer kind of shows up in all these different things, and it's usually beer going bad that causes innovation.
Yeah.
I love that. I think it's safe to say that America was formed on the basis of beer, and I am so happy with that concluding statement. Well, we're at 7:30.
I know. Mary, didn't you have just one more thing? You had something to show us, right? Didn't you bring one of your boots?
Oh yeah, before the last thing, I did take another object from our ed closet. I brought our ale shoe. Ooh, maybe.
The ale shoe,
Okay.
yeah.
It'll go right in front of my face so we can still kind of see it. I'm not very good at this. So the ale shoe was another way to warm up a drink. It's actually hollow on the inside. So what you would do is you would put your cold liquid in here, probably like the ale that Catherine would have to warm up to make the flip, and it would go in the hollow piece, and you'd stick it into the fire for it to boil. So it's one of my favorite things, because when you ask the kids what they think this is, everybody says a shoe at first, which, you know, I normally make them take off one of their shoes and try on like Cinderella. But it's one of my favorite like little innovations, and it's got a flat bottom, so you can always, you know, warm up your beer and iron your clothes at the same time. So everybody likes a good multitasking tool, but it's definitely, it was nice. I got really excited. I was like, I'm going to take that out of the ed closet. I haven't seen that in a year.
Yeah,
Amazing.
it's a fun object.
It's
And
really-
Catherine, do you have something special in Timothy's tap room, tavern to
We
show
have
us?
a couple of different tankards. So one that I really like is our wooden stave tankard, which is very old. This is probably one of the older objects in our collection. So it's so this is a tankard. It's made out of wooden staves, just like a barrel, which I think is pretty cool. And we also have a blackjack, which is a beer mug made out of leather. And it's been jacked, which means it's been coated in like a pine tar to make it waterproof. But this is another kind of fun thing you could drink your beer out of.
As Catherine, what's the volume of the wooden tankard? It's huge.
It is very huge, and I'm not sure. It's probably more beer than would be healthy for one sitting.
No, that's not right. We've learned the opposite tonight.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, it's pretty large. I'm really bad at estimating volumes, so I'm not going to try.
Yeah. We should try and test it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I know it's almost time, but I did want to wish everybody a happy National Beer Day tomorrow.
Yes.
So tomorrow is National Beer Day. It's actually the day that FDR signed into law the Cullen-Harrison Act, which allowed for the sale of beer during Prohibition back in 1933. So I did find out that the day that law went into effect, April 7th, 1933, people gathered outside of breweries and drank 1.5 million barrels of beer in that day. So, you know, happy National Beer Day. And yeah, thank you all for joining us. Is there any last questions? I know we're over time.
Any last questions? Anyone? No? Thanks. Yeah, and so thank you all for attending. It's wonderful seeing so many people here. And Catherine's going to send out our survey, and we really appreciate your honest feedback. You know, let us know what you enjoyed and what we could improve or some new topics. And then we're planning, well, that's the royal we. So, you know, Mary Catherine and her team, their team is planning season 2. So we're very ambitious with Tavern Tasting. We're now, you know, thinking about syndicating our Tavern Tasting season. So we look forward to the first episode of season 2, and it'll be late summer, fall, right, Mary Kathy? That's sort of, yeah, right. Okay. So thank you everyone for attending. Really, it was nice seeing you, and have a good night, and happy National Beer Day tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.
Beer
Always a
Day.
pleasure. Thank you, Barry, for joining.
No problem, guys. Great.
Thanks, Barry.
Seeing you.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.